where we really are all one is in being nothing. That is, being an open, infinite potential to become everything. Or, it's different for every person, but every person has their own infinite potential. But that you find in your non-identity. In non-identity, we are all equal, right? If that deepest stratum, I mean, in the Middle Ages, this would be God. It would be being, right? An absolute, unqualified being that is the foundation of every being that is, and that is shared in common. It's what enables us to be in all of our diversified ways. To return to that, which I'm calling non-identity, I think is a much needed move in our current climate of conflict and total misunderstanding, even not being able to hold a dialogue with those that are in the opposite camp and embrace a different ideology. What we need, ironically, is not less but more self-critical self-examination. This is ironic because Western culture has undermined itself precisely through its overzealous self-critique. This is wokeism. But the critique has not been deep and honest or lucid or true enough to see past the superficially divisive logic that seems to furnish simple binary solutions. We've wanted to identify guilty parties who can be purged rather than understand systematically the roots of evil in social violence and injustice. Although it is difficult for us to think without defined concepts of finite entities, a first step to overcoming exclusionary violence and to thinking genuine inclusiveness is recognition of the non-identical. This requires thinking from the common ground that is not yet identified or articulated in anyone's lexicon and can be intimated only before all definitions by whatever groups or individuals. This I take to be the key to transcending divisive identities and illusions of self-control. The non-identical is what self-reflection reveals when we look self-critically into the abyss of the self, or even into any collective identity. The self gapes open as a great void without any identity all its own. It's constituted instead by relations, by having infinite possibilities of relation, right? This is where Don Quixote can come in, but also with Hamlet, and actually I go, it's Dante, as was mentioned at the beginning in the Vita Nuova. In his relation to Beatrice, he is reduced to absolute non-entity, right? She's the revelation, really, of the divine for him. She's everything. He becomes nothing. And this, I think, is the beginning of our modern subjectivity, which, of course, we've sort of lost track of. But being defined relationally and being nothing in and for oneself in isolation is the lesson that I like to bring out of these great works of modern literature. Dante's Vita Nuova, I do put it at it's a culmination of the Middle Ages, but it is also the inauguration, really, of this new, absolutely self-reflective subjectivity, which undermines itself as an isolated self in order then to open this dimension of infinite relationality. So a crucial question facing our world, especially in the present critical climate, is how are we going to stop fighting with one another, right? Republicans against Democrats, Russia against the West, China against Taiwan, the United States, wokes against rednecks, progressives against diehard conservatives. The healthy competition between rivals built into the model of democratic self-government has been degraded and turned into a deadly duel to discredit, subdue, and destroy one's opponent. The political adversary becomes one's inadmissible nemesis. So the next section is transcending divisive identities and delusions of total control, the role of religion. Again, I'm wondering, wokeism turns out to be more about who is right than about what is right. I'm going to get a signal about time here.
Yes, because otherwise we don't have.
Yes.
We can have.
Of course, yeah. Okay. Did she say 10 minutes or something? Or 12?
Yes, 10 minutes.
Is that what she? Yeah. Okay. Right. No, I realized that the time is limited. So, one of the topics that I'm going to address the next time actually is universality, coming out of that Frankfurt school, and how we've sort of lost faith in that anything can be universal. And one of the points that I make about these identities, these abstractions, they're all shared. All of these characteristics, those social identities, but they really count only when they are performed, appropriated and performed by a singular individual. Then they begin to count, and then they're always intersectional. You can't reason abstractly in terms of just woman or white. It all depends how these things, intersect. And that creates this unique fingerprint, the inimitable aura of the individual. And so this is, moving towards this religious dimension, that's singularity, that I did try to evoke. It's a moment ago with even evoking sort of a medieval conception of God as being. The malaise of our culture, as I'm describing it, is that these descriptors have become so dominant and decisive in woke saturated culture, and common humanity, like any universal, is only a potential and nothing positively present or definable or fixed, and ultimately a non-identity. And this accounts for its being overlooked and ignored and shunted aside by the more officiously visible identities, right? So that it's nothing in particular, and you can't really grasp it conceptually the way. So we lose track of it completely, and somehow or other we have to refocus to be able to take account of that which is the most essential, even though there's no name or word for it. That we have to relate to one another out of that depth. Consciousness of such these divisively defined identities becomes a motive for exclusionary and invidious valuations and behaviors, and thus becomes tyrannical in its turn. Now, there's something that I've mentioned. This will then be the last major idea that I want to be sure is on the table. I mentioned this idea of scapegoating, and actually the conference said scapegoating, capro expiatorio.
Chivo expiatorio, no? Okay. Chivo expiatorio.
Sì,
right.
grazie, sì. And this was the first conference in Les Bernardins that was mentioned. It was about René Girard, actually, and and I did talk about wokeism, but because he's the great theorist, right, of the scapegoat, and I'm trying to suggest that we can really understand wokeism in terms of scapegoating as Girard lays it out, although it's he comes somewhat before the craze about wokeism. He did not really engage with it, but using his principles, what happens in society in order to try to diffuse the violence that arises between us because we are rivals for all kinds of things. But in his theory, it's mimetic desire. What we desire, what we think we want, it's always dependent on what we see others. There's the model. Desire is by its nature imitative, and that makes it rivalrous, right? You want the same thing that somebody else wants. And this does create a mimetic crisis, and we are really in a mimetic crisis. The mimetic crisis is accentuated, intensified by the loss of differentiation in society. And this is what we want to cancel these differences, the inequality, because inequalities. We can affirm, I think, an absolutely equal and infinite worth of each individual, and I would say it's incommensurable, right? More than equal, it's incommensurable. Everyone has their own absolute value, all right? But in the mimetic crisis that's generated from primordial human communities, even up to our mass societies today, with this mechanism of mimetic desire, we are thrust into these, they're competitive societies. There can be good aspects as well as bad of competition, but it does become violent and destructive. We see this over and over again. So how do we deal with this? Through the scapegoat. You have to find someone who is, by common consensus, guilty of whatever ails the society. You run him out of town, or you put her to death, and that's how the society reconciles all of these, the competing members, by the illusion that it's not their own mutual aggressiveness, but it can be limited to a certain individual, or it could be a group. And what I'm really suggesting is that this identity, social identity, has served in woke circles, the heterosexual white male, that identity is being used as a scapegoat to try to pacify and to create the consensus, and it's empowering. See, the other thing is it's always it's taken over for empowerment. The elites that are using the wokest wave, in order, the idea is obviously to advantage the downtrodden and all. As that quote from Patterson points out, it usually doesn't, very often doesn't work that way. But what I want to say here about the scapegoat, it seems maybe implausible. Come on, whites, males, what you're saying, that they're the scapegoat? How can, they're much too large and, much too powerful and privileged to be scapegoats. But in the symbolic logic, they can be a single identity up against multiple identities, right? We've got a proliferation of identities. That's how this whole thing has worked, the rainbow effect. And so you move from the war of all against all to all against one. That's the scapegoat mechanism, how it works. And I think that that wokeism has been based to a considerable extent on finding this scapegoat as a single identity among many. All right, and then it works, and you can be, then we're convinced. Yeah, it's because men have always been. What's wrong with the world? Well, look, there's all these men in charge, and they're the whites dominating the world, and so. That can become, I think, a persuasive outlook for many groups. Becomes a narrative, and it's always these narratives. They can be really wildly out of sorts with real experience on the ground. This is what Quixote demonstrates as well. Belief, it's socially propagated, right? You believe it because everyone else believes it, and it passes around. Well, I do want to leave time now, and it was important, I think, to get to that point. It leaves a lot of loose ends. I'll try and pick up with this theme of universality next time, and then go into the more into the religious, negative, theological, apophatic dimensions to conclude. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is a lecture series. So this time was this phenomenological approach in the sense of looking at the phenomena, and then in the other lectures in the next days. Not tomorrow, but
Thursday
and Friday, he will go more into this deep idea of the universality in the
logic,
and so on. So, do you have questions? Okay, then it's David, Francesco, Santi, Alex, and Nico. Okay, let's go.
Okay.
David.
Just the first thing is just a side comment, which is whether the infinite obligations of Levinas, what they have how they're related to the Ordo Amoris or the Order of Charity, in which you have different types of obligations towards different groups, and that makes it more kind of psychologically manageable. Our obligations towards humanity are much more manageable if we can actually order them in some way, and that seems to be in tension with, as I understand it, this infinite obligation of Levinas. But maybe I'm mistaken about that. And the other.
Should I comment on that?
Oh yeah, sure.
You're going to go. Yeah. I think it's really ethical. His whole philosophy, ethics is first philosophy for him. The order of Amoris of I would say what he introduces the idea of Lucia, the third. Things become more complicated when we're not looking just at a binary relationship, right? You vis-a-vis the other. Then there's this absolute demand. But when there's a third person who's being threatened by the other, the ethics becomes much more complicated. What's your obligation to defend, right? Nevertheless, there's always the obligation to the others and to all others. I mean, that is the basis. And it's interesting. I'm using love, I have to say. I'm finding that I need it in my own, but I don't really see where that would come in for the
Okay.
Yeah, you go on to your.
The other thing is just I'm wondering how you assess the kind of sociologically and theologically you assess the woke movement, because the way I see it is, it looks to me like a kind of a pathological expression of the religious impulse in some ways. It's a deviation of the religious impulse, and in that sense, what does religion permit us to do? I mean, what does it allow us to do? I think it allows us to live with the burden of sin, the burden of our sinfulness and our finitude, because if you don't have any sense that there's a providential God, or any sense that there's a kind of infinite order, that the universe has a kind of someone's in charge, so to speak, that there's an order that we can count on, then the observation of injustice and sin, both in ourselves and in others, can be absolutely oppressive. It can be absolutely oppressive, and that kind of tension and pressure gives rise to explosion, revolution, violence, etc. And so what I'm wondering is if you think that maybe indirectly the woke movement is actually an argument for traditional religion, in a sense that maybe it doesn't show the truth of traditional religion, but perhaps it shows that it somehow can channel these inquietudes, this disquiet more successfully, certainly more functionally, in the sense that it doesn't necessarily result in this kind of very quickly in this kind of, let's just say, a one-sided view of things where sin is in one group rather than another.
Certainly, the religious dimension is crucial for wokeism. I see it really as coming from the claim of a kind of absoluteness. When you move into, this is absolutely right, unquestionable, you can become dogmatic, you can persecute heretics, right, those that don't agree, and we see all of these phenomena. In listening to you, however, I can see a way in which maybe the wokeism is missing religion by not according forgiveness, for example. The past, everything in the past is going to be dredged up, and somebody's going to pay for this, right? Nothing can be forgiven as over and done with, and in some ways, you can never be done with the past. There's always more, unless at some point you forgive. So that would be a way in which the wokeism is missing some of the resources of religion. But I agree absolutely that it is trying to resource, and it's based on impulses, sentiments that feed religion. There is this religious fervor, absolutely, and with all the attempts.
It's like a substitutive religion,
Absolutely. Yeah.
but dominated by politics. So politics could be the judgment of God would be the political
So it
judgment.
becomes an idolatrous religion as well, and you know these social identities become idols. Yeah.
Francesco.
So thanks for the lecture. I have a bit of emotion because I'm new here. So yeah, the first thing is about René Girard, that he says that preoccupation for victims is like the mark of Christianity, you know, in history.
Who is this?
René Girard.
Ah oui, okay.
So, for example, in the ancient Roman society, we don't have that. So Christianity like brings into history this preoccupation for victims, and that's why in the modern times we worry about women or people with disability and so on. So the René Girard underlines that the problem now is that this atheistic society takes this element out of Christianity but against Christianity. So also in the woke culture we see that we can't think out of this distinctive element of our culture, but out of the Christian,
Cosmovision.
yeah.
Absolutely. Wokeism is the apotheosis of Christianity, and its reversal at the same time. And in fact, in answering David's question, I wanted to differentiate between, pre-Christian religions, which do work very much on, they can work on the model of scapegoating. For Girard, we have a solution to the scapegoat. It's the sacrifice of Christ, as a scapegoat to end the need to always find a new scapegoat. And wokeism, however, is remaining within, bogged down. It's remaining stuck within the scapegoat mechanism, even though it is all inspired by the caring for the victim. And Christian, and this is very much central actually to my whole project, is how Christianity revolutionized the world. Wokeism is continuing that revolution, but betraying it at the same time, as is typically the case. Revolution always evolves into something else, some kind of terror, some kind of religion of oppression. And so wokeism, I think, has this tendency now to become the religion of oppression, coming out of the inspiration of the Christian gospel. There's no longer male nor female, no longer slave nor free. You are all one in Jesus Christ.
So now was Alex, I think. Santi.
Thank you. Welcome again,
Thank you,
William.
Santi.
So, I have lots of comments to say, but I'm going to say one thing because we will
catch up
discuss these
later.
days, exactly.
Right.
I'm particularly interested in your concept of non-identity. And I saw this afternoon, I know I read some of your books and so on. I think you proceed like Kabbalah in the Middle Ages, sic et non. Because it's theology, negative theology, identity, non-identity. And I use your writings on the canon in my book, you will see, and it's more or less the way you approach the subjects. One suggest I can give you. I don't know if the manuscript it's done or not. If you have finished everything.
Yeah. I'll
Okay.
give it to you. Sure.
Because
But it is open.
Open or
William?
not?
It's
Is it still
the
open,
manuscript.
William, or
Is it
not?
still
Yeah.
open?
Uh,
The manuscript.
Yeah, that's right. I have a due date to send it in February.
Right. So perhaps what I'm going to say, it's no works for you, but identity. It's true that it's becoming problematic nowadays because the most people stress the identity, the most frontiers put on the others, between the others, and so on. We know this in Spain, for instance, in the subject of nationalists, the problem of Catalonia, and so on. The most stress your Catalan, supposed Catalan identity, you separate from others, or to the other side the same. And this is for religion, for race, for gender, etc. But what I feel is problematic in your subject is that, in some sense, you need some identity, some amount of identity.
Absolutely.
And then I don't know until what extent in your manuscript you are going to nuance this, to
Right.
balance this,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
otherwise people can read your manuscript saying, okay, he's going to the other side, but he's not giving an alternative to this
Right.
problem.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm not going to give an alternative because then we are in some kind of binary logic. I want to, déjouer would be the dichotomy itself.
Right.
But that's not enough. I agree that it's the way of giving something positive in place of the identities that are being critiqued and dismantled. I don't want to discard them. On the contrary, and there's actually a lot about how we do construct our unique individual selves on the basis of these identities that that each has a unique repertoire. Some of it's given to us, and we work with identities, and I'm not against. On the contrary, and non-identity, it's the logic of negative theology as well. There is no negative theology without the cataphatic affirmative theology. So, the focus on identity is not trying to obliterate identity, but to use it in a non-oppositional way. And our very language and our thinking is based on difference. We can't avoid that, but we don't have to fixate those differences. We remain flexibly open, and then there's this religious dimension, which is an opening to the undifferentiated. That sounds too abstract to put it that way, and that's why it's in living your concrete identities in a way that opens them up to their opposite. And this is in the spirit of trans, actually. So I would absolutely not want to say, look, this trans nonsense, enough of that. No, this is a revelation as well of something that is part of all of us, and in different ways. I don't want to exclude them. We're going to learn from everyone, and especially those that are opposed to us.
Okay, thank you.
Alex.
Si no hay problema, voy a hablar en castellano.
Y vamos viendo.
Bueno, muchas gracias por venir y por esta introducción a tu libro. Y yo quería seguir un poco justo el mismo tema que Santi, que has hablado de la identidad y el desprenderse de la propia identidad. Y tiene que ver con lo que acabas de decir. Y supongo que pasado mañana, cuando hables de la universalidad, seguirás hablando de esto. Pero claro, a veces tenemos una idea un poco excesivamente abstracta de la identidad y pensamos en identidades o culturas como fronteras fijas, cuando en realidad ni las identidades ni las culturas son fronteras fijas, sino es constante hibridación, mezcla, y efectivamente, lo has dicho bien, no podemos desprendernos, ni siquiera la autocrítica sigue siendo una marca de identidad de la cultura occidental. O sea, somos seres humanos, seres racionales, y eso forma parte de nuestra identidad. Entonces es interesante porque estaba pensando por contraste, claro, hablas de una universalidad yendo hacia atrás de las identidades, ¿no? Volver a esa infinitud previa a las identidades. Pero estaba pensando en otros autores que también hacen una apuesta por la universalidad y, digamos, una dimensión muy relacional, como Kant, por ejemplo, o Hegel, que claro, ellos lo que proponen es llegar a la universalidad asumiendo o más adelante de las identidades, o sea, asumiendo la constante conflicto y comunicación, ¿no?, de las identidades, se va llegando a una, como no una síntesis, pero sí una dimensión comunicativa o una elevación o una universalidad asumiendo las diversidades, pero diversidades no como fronteras rígidas, sino como diferencias que se enriquecen mutuamente y que forman parte de una comunidad. Entonces es una universalidad, digamos, por encima o asumiendo las identidades, no desprendiéndose, o sea, no es una infinitud, sino una universidad, que es la idea de la humanidad, no la humanidad o una universidad. Entonces, claro, ¿por qué o sea, ¿en qué sentido? No sé si lo hablarás pasado mañana. ¿Por qué hay que pensar en una inidentidad o un previo a la identidad o una no infinitud previa para pensar en la universalidad o en una humanidad, digamos, reconciliada, contando con la riqueza de la diferencia? Y sobre todo eso, porque a veces pensamos en fronteras cuando las culturas y las identidades son mezclas, son hibridación. Constantemente no hay una cultura pura, jamás ha existido.
No, fantástico. Es exactamente así que pienso. And I like the fact
You can answer in English.
yeah, right. I like your evoking Kant and Hegel. A typical gesture of we're way beyond now Kant and Hegel. Now we have and those universal philosophers. No, on the contrary, as you are suggesting, they discover the universal in ways, in their own times that open it, that open the universal beyond any kind of a fixed formulation, that enable humanity to live the universal. It's not the same for us today, but Kant, it is the philosophical universalism. I really learned from them the essential movements of thought, and today in our context, our movements are somewhat different. But and I like the way más encima, the relational way of describing universality. It's always in relation to a previous formation of what universality represents. Well, Kant takes us to another stage, to really another level of insight into the universal. And but of course, his is still with the categories of pure reason and practical reason. Hegel then drags those categories into history, and there's another dimension to universality. Hegel is still a philosopher, absolutely a philosopher of universality, but it's transformed itself into now an evolving historical being, which of course, and that also coincides with an important thrust of Christian revelation, and as Hegel himself is very aware.
So, Nico eres, ¿no?
Sí, no sé si me puede... pusiste muy
Párate un poquito, sí, y te veo mejor. En English,
como prefieran.
como tú prefieras.
Yeah, la verdad es que bueno. So yeah, I'm gonna make the question in English. So my question is going to be more about this internal contradiction. So I'm not a philosopher, so I study art stuff. But it was really interesting. Thank you for that.
What do you study?
PP.
PP. Politics, philosophy, and economics.
So there was a it's not a debate, but like a talk between Camille Paglia and Christina Hoff Summers, and they were saying something interesting about this wokeism or woke movement. They were saying that in the 80s, probably, as professors of university, they saw the internal contradiction of this movement, and they thought that this was gonna fall apart. It didn't. So right now, in some way, I think this is like you were saying. But in my viewpoint, we're living like Hobbesian viewpoint, but like this among mini lupus, but at the most extreme point. So there's a lot of internal contradictions inside this movement. I mean, if we talk about feminism, and you have a collective women, you cannot like make a single body of it, because you have like fat women, black women, I know, poor women, migration and that kind of stuff. So how can you see this constant continuity inside this movement? Because apparently it's constantly breaking, but it doesn't break, and it's constantly moving. So yeah, basically is that. Thank you.
No, I think it's very interesting to think of the internal contradictions, and according to a Hegelian logic, especially filtered through Marx, one would say, so that condemns capitalism because of its internal contradictions. It has to fall apart, and that would be a good example of how the internal contradiction, which does come out. I don't think we can deny those internal contradictions, but those are between the abstract formulas. Capitalism defined in this way contradicts another aspect that's defined. The vitality of this economic activity is not really confined to any of the formulas. This is just, I think, your question is pointing out how using the abstractions that we inevitably do in any theory, and you evoke the feminist theories, which have contradicted each other, from the first wave feminism all the way to the third wave feminism, and now what Kimberly Crenshaw has come down hard critiquing even the lesbian movement. They all turn at a certain point against themselves, by this impetus of internal contradiction, and to observe that, I think, is very instructive, and then to observe that it can belong to the vitality and even maybe the truth. It's only a fairly limited, rigid, maybe Aristotelian logic that would tell you that the law of non-contradiction, that you can't have contradiction. The very nature of life, bound with death, is contradictory. We use this principle of contradiction in order to work through the various aspects of a movement, and we make choices. We do discard elements, but we're always living, I think, from contradictions. That internal contradiction is never going to be resolved, except at the level of abstract ideas. But as long as we're living an internal contradiction. I think that really comes out in this movement of wokeism, which I'm not trying to knock it. I'm not trying to refute it. On the contrary, it's a revelation. It's a revelation of the Christian truth, I think, and also of the betrayal of that truth, in its own internal contradiction.
Okay. Oye, pues bueno, ¿hay alguna pregunta más? Igual habría. Yolanda, pues venga, la última para acabar. Porque a las 8 tenemos tiempo.
Okay, so
No, tenemos 2 minutos.
so we can
No,
talk
digo
about...
que normalmente acabamos a las 8, pero...
Okay, so no, just thank you very much. It's a pleasure to listen to you again. 5 years later, I think, no, more or less. Yeah. So I would like to go back to this question of identity, non-identity. I think it's because it's like a part of your proposal somehow, your reflection. I just would like to point out a notion, and that is human nature. So as he said somehow, only if there is something common, we can communicate. A human nature, a concept of human nature that can incorporate change, temporality. So this and the ability to be able to communicate and hybridize or whatever. No? For example, this woke notion, very famous nowadays, cultural appropriation. So it seems to forget that we are hybrids, so that we make this. Of course, there were abuses and so all these things, but we recognize the non-identical only if we have somehow a concept of identity based on something that we can recognize in the other. No? Just a point about all this. No?
All right. This something in common that as you say, we have to have. It's
incorporating change.
Okay.
So that is
Right.
already a concept of human nature.
Right.
That should be.
That's something we do grasp it under various aspects. We define it in different ways, but whatever that something is, we're not going to understand it the same. we're not going to really agree on what that something in common that we all have. The way we define it in the West or in China, right? Universal human rights. So that's something. We'd like to. What is this something that we can all grasp together? Well, I think it's the aspiration simply to try to learn from one another what it is that we share in common, and we're not going to grasp it as something. We're going to live it as the nothing in which we are all connected, and at the deepest level, really, we're nothing, right? We're very ex nihilo as creatures. So I like the fact that you say, what is this something that we share in common, and we have to go there in order then to release it. Okay, it's not something that I can actually define.
Thank you for today.
Okay, yeah.
Then we will